This week's presenting sponsor is the Cleveland Foundation, which serves to enhance the lives of all residents of Greater Cleveland, to build community endowment, address needs through grant making, and provide leadership on key community issues. I would like to welcome Ron Richard, President and CEO, to greet you on behalf of the Cleveland Foundation.
Good morning and welcome. The Cleveland Foundation is proud to serve as this week's presenting sponsor because we've been investing in the future of our city, Cleveland, Ohio, for more than a century. The Cleveland Foundation was the world's first community foundation. Our founder, Frederick Harris Goff, created this placed-based and placed-making movement that has been adopted and adapted by citizens on every continent except Antarctica. But we're working on that. By strengthening civil society, community foundations, now more than 1,800 worldwide, are helping to enhance global and local leadership and to build a better world, place by place, city by city. And it all started in 1914 in Cleveland, Ohio. And ever since this inspiring beginning, the Cleveland Foundation has partnered with our passionate donors and outstanding nonprofit organizations in Cuyahoga Lake and Geauga counties to keep our communities strong, vibrant, and resilient. So from Monday through Thursday of this week, I invite you to join us at 12:30 p.m. at the Athenaeum Hotel Parlor for lunchtime conversations on exciting work happening in Cleveland every day to ensure our city's continued renaissance. These Fred Talks, you've heard of TED Talks, we have Fred Talks, named after our founder, Fred Goff, and created in partnership with the City Club of Cleveland, a wonderful institution in Cleveland. They showcase the leaders and organizations working on the ground in Cleveland to enhance the lives of our residents and to protect the future of our city. We'll be discussing the role of technology in connecting people to prosperity, the power of the arts to heal young minds and transform public spaces, the dream of a neighborhood that welcomes refugees from around the world to Cleveland, and the creation of a greener city on our blue lake. These are conversations you won't want to miss, so please join us. I'm also honored to host a conversation on Tuesday at 2 p.m. on the role of the faith-based community in Cleveland as part of the Chautauqua Interfaith Lecture Series. And then on Wednesday at 3:30, we're partnering with the Chautauqua Library and Scientific Circle to highlight our Anisfield Wolf Book Awards, the only national juried prize for the best books on race and diversity since 1935. Both of these discussions will take place in the Hall of Philosophy. On Friday afternoon at 3:30 in the Smith Wilkes Hall, we'll partner with all of you through an interactive session to use the learnings from throughout the week to advance cities around the entire world. And don't forget to stop by on Bester Plaza or the Athenaeum Hotel lobby throughout the week to share your ideas on the future of cities and on our interactive city blueprints. We'd really love to get your input. We're honored to learn with you this week, and we look forward to the Chautauqua tradition of outstanding dialogue and making memorable connections. So thank you so much for being here. Hope to see you in many places this entire week. Thanks so much.
Today's lecture is underwritten by the Dr. Edwin Prince Booth Memorial Fund. Dr. Booth was a lifelong Chautauquan and frequent Chautauqua lecturer in the 1950s and 60s. His family has continued his legacy on the grounds, with now 6 generations participating in Chautauqua. This lecture is also one of this summer's designated morning lectures in the Lincoln Applied Ethics program. Please join me in thanking the Cleveland Foundation and the Booth and Lincoln families for their support of Chautauqua. David Simon is deeply familiar with urban life in America. as creator, writer, and producer of hit television shows The Wire, set in Baltimore, and Treme, set in New Orleans, Mr. Simon strived to authentically and honestly portray the social, economic, and political aspects of life in the American city. By the way, in a conversation with President Obama last year, the president touted The Wire as, quote, the greatest not just television shows, but pieces of art in at least the past 2 decades. Mr. Simon began his professional career reporting for the Baltimore Sun and has now written or co-written 4 books, including Homicide, A Year on the Killing Streets, and The Corner, A Year in the Life of an Inner-City Neighborhood. Mr. Simon's recent pilot for HBO, The Deuce, about the New York porn industry in the 1970s and 80s, has now been picked up as a series for the network. Mr. Simon was last here in 2013 for an evening lecture during our week on crime and punishment, and we are honored to have him back with us today. Please join me in welcoming David Simon back to Chautauqua.
So, thank you. There are a few sacred rules in my new profession of show business. One of them is never follow the guys who sweep up the amphitheater. I won't draw that kind of applause no matter what I say. I can't pander enough to beat that. That was grand. I was here 3 years ago, and I disappointed everybody then, I think, by not talking about The Wire or television or, Omar or whatever. Instead, I talked about the policy junk, thinking it's Chautauqua. This is idea country. We'll do the big stuff. So this year, I thought I'd come back and just disappoint you more. I can't help it. But I thought I would build on what we talked about 3 years ago here, which was, at the time it seemed quite timely to me, which was that for the first time in generations, in decades, the drug war had come into question. The idea of mass incarceration had come into question 3 years ago, and I felt as if I was not going to live long enough to see us walk that back, even in our minds. And it had started to happen 3 years ago when I was here. I'm not suggesting that the edifice of mass incarceration or the disaster that is the American drug prohibition is about to fall, but it is in some retreat, and the whole code of locking up other Americans for what is essentially a public health problem and using that as an overlay for social control and for racial control has started to fall apart. And I'm only 55, so I thought I would be, gumming my food by the time it happened. So we're doing great. But we're also, if you've been watching anything going on over the last year since Ferguson, you've been watching this incredible seeming deterioration of trust, of sort of communicative tissue in our communities, particularly our big cities, when it comes to issues of race, policing, violence, the role of the criminal justice system. It seems as if the thing has been hollowed out, or that the progress that many people assumed would be there in the generations since civil rights took hold and certain forms of policing were seemingly banished. That it's all come back rushing up at us. And I thought we should talk about that. Because this is, in some sense, the cost of what we talked about 3 years ago. And it's being borne now. And it was sort of inevitable. Why is it happening now? Well, it's time. It was a long time to go. But the single reason is this revolution right here. Is your smartphone, is the camera that follows us everywhere. I was a police reporter for 13 years, and really longer than that if you count the time spent doing the nonfiction books. And I covered a lot of police shootings. And some of them were good in the sense that the person had to be shot. Some of them were, there was no way to know. It was just two people there and one of them was dead. Or one of them maybe wasn't dead, but in a court of law, the police officer was going to prevail. And a few of them, there were actually witnesses who held on to accounts that were different from the police officer, and those became controversies. But they were very, it was a very rare thing when that happened. Often I would go to a scene of a police shooting and somebody would say, they shot him in the back, they shot him down like a dog, they shot him, there was a lot of commentary on the street about what the police had done wrong. And it would never get to the grand jury. What you say in front of a television camera is what you say in front of a television camera. What you're willing to say in front of a grand jury with lawyers all around is very different. Possibly because the witness was intimidated by authorities, but also possibly because what you say in front of a grand jury has to be true, and nobody's willing to risk perjury, but they're willing to say anything in front of a TV camera. And there was no real way for a reporter to know it. I could sense that the game was rigged, that if you were a police officer, you had innumerable advantages on the way to having a police shooting investigated. I could suspect certain officers in certain circumstances. There was some boilerplate probable cause that I heard in an awful lot of reports. You're taught how to write as a police officer, particularly as a detective who might be investigating a police shooting. And the ability to write your way out of trouble is not to be underestimated. But in the end, it came down to one person's word against another, and the first person's word was a sworn police officer. The camera has changed everything. The phone camera has proven that there was something there all along, something we suspected, something that could not have been ascertained without first-generation evidence. And what was there was basically a rigged game that is against both sides. I'm going to try to channel for you today the sentiments, and I'm neither one, so it'll be flawed in every sense, but I'm going to try to channel the sentiments of, a young black male in my city who has grown up being policed in Baltimore at any point in my lifetime, but particularly in the years since the drug war ratcheted up, and I would date that from, I would say, the 1980s, 1990s, mid-1980s to the present, and also a working police officer. And from both their points of view, the drug war and the overlay of the drug war on the dynamic of policing in American city has destroyed policing, it's destroyed trust, it's damaged communities, it's accomplished none of what it said it would accomplish, and it's actually impeded all that we need to do. And the problem basically is this. We gave the police department an impossible task, which was to enforce an unenforceable prohibition. And in doing so, we gave them a tool for social control over the poor and over these neighborhoods where the drug culture became entrenched. That was it was the most blunt and brutal hammer you could possibly hand anyone and ask them to do good work. And police work, when it's done well, is really good work, and it's really nuanced. And the greatest asset you need is information. A police department doesn't run on its bullets, on its guns, on its armored personnel carriers, on its nightsticks. It runs on information. If people talk to the police, if the police can compel the right people to talk to them, if a detective knows when he's being lied to, if he knows how to use an informant, not be used by an informant, he can make cases. He can lock the right people up. And that's the only thing that police are good at. Whenever you're being sold sharing and caring by your police department, whenever a mayor or a guy running for mayor or city council, whenever they talk to you about, we're going to get back to the old days, foot patrols, community policing, sharing, caring, look them in the eye and say, hire a social worker. They're really good at that. You want your police department to be making the right arrests. If they make the right arrests, if they can do retroactive investigation well, you will start to control crime in your city. If they can't, you will not control crime. It's as simple as that. Well, for 30 years longer, I watched as police departments walked away from actual police work and instead went over to arresting people for drugs, as if that was police work. Well, one of these things, police work, requires levels of competence and maintenance of informational sources that are impressive to me as a reporter, would be impressive to an academic if they paid attention. I mean, these things are remarkable skill sets. Locking people up for drugs is basically in a place like Baltimore and doing fish in the barrel, which is to say, all you get up against the wall, I'm going into your pockets. Oh, you didn't find it in your pocket? It's down on the street there? Okay, this one belongs to you. Take the charge. I got a stat, I'm getting court pay, I'm getting overtime. You know, I did this at the end of my shift, so I'll get 4 extra hours processing at evidence control. The 10 pills of cocaine I just got, I'll go to court, I'll get paid, and then at the end of the month, I'll have 30 arrests, and it'll look like I'm doing my job, and I'll get promoted, and I'll be the sergeant, and I'll be the guy who trains the next generation of police how not to do their jobs. That was the drug war. That's what destroyed the police department in my city. Well, the actual communities in my city, they were going to have those drug problems regardless, and this forum, sadly, is too short to go into all the reasons why drugs have a prevalence in poor communities. But suffice to say, the corner is the one place that's hiring in West Baltimore, and all the factories are gone, and whatever else it does. When you go up to the corner to sell drugs, you've solved your existential crisis. You have a job, or if you go up there to get high, you've solved your existential crisis. You have the hardest job in America, which is being a drug addict. But we cannot get into all of the reasons why drugs have a prevalence and why getting people off of drugs is such a long-term fight, and why it requires so much more of our resources than we're giving it. Leave that to the side for a moment and just look at what it did to making the cities unsafe. Jill Levy published a book, LA Times reporter, called Ghettocide. I don't know if anyone's read it. It's a very good book. It mimics perfectly my own experience in Baltimore, which is to say, she looked at the homicide rate and the clearance rate in South Central LA, places like Compton and Florence. The clearance rate, meaning the arrest rate by detectives, was 30%, 34, 35%, meaning they solved, or they cleared off the books 35% of the homicides in those neighborhoods. That doesn't sound very good, does it? Well, it's worse, because that's only what they clear on paper. What actually might get prosecuted, I'm going to guess, based on my own experience in Baltimore, is about 10% through the courts, meaning your chance of killing somebody and being punished for it in South Central LA, not all of LA, but just the African American communities, Latino communities of South Central LA, is about 1 in 10. So 9 times out of 10, you shoot somebody, stab somebody, nothing's going to happen to you. In Baltimore, right now, the clearance rate for homicide is about 17%. That means your chance of actually being punished is less than 10% when it shakes out at the courthouse. How did we get to this point? And believe me, it was a nosedive, because when I was in the homicide unit to write my first book, which was only 1988, the clearance rate was 70%. They solved 7 out of 10 crimes, and I tracked those cases through the courthouse. 40% of them resulted in jail time. Now, we can all argue about what we want the police to do in our society and what they should be engaged in. And I certainly am, unalterably opposed to, the drug war and making drug. I've said repeatedly, and I think I said here, if I was ever on a jury and they gave me a non-violent drug offense to consider, I would vote to acquit. I don't need to hear the evidence. I would try to nullify that jury with everything in my soul. But I am all for the police locking somebody up when they take a human life. In fact, I don't see how you construct a society where that doesn't happen. And in fact, the greatest cost, of course, is not to people like me, although I live in Baltimore City. It's to people in African American communities, particularly young African American males. There, the rate of death from homicide is so extreme as to be genocidal in my city. And the people, it's gone on as long as it had, because if it was happening to white folk, we would have addressed this by now. Only in places like Baltimore, where the cohort that is being so grievously brutalized is, to the vast majority, African American, could you reach a point at which you were not actually punishing the crime of murder systemically? And the reason is because when I was in the homicide unit in '88, the phone would ring. The phone would ring. And now, a lot of people didn't want to be witnesses in court, but they wanted the guy to go off the corner when he kept shooting people. And the phone would ring, and the detective would pick up the phone and say, yeah, I have that case. And somebody calling from the 4100 block of Old York Road would say, okay, well, Tater shot him. Who's Tater? Well, he lives at this address. And he shot this kid Roddy last week. Who was out in the corner? Can you give me the name of a witness? And the information would come in. The phone doesn't ring in the Baltimore Police Department anymore. And the reason is they locked everybody up. They didn't hold them for anything because, of course, in a city that is as drug saturated as Baltimore, you can't take a drug arrest and put it into an actual prison cell. Not only would it be draconian and destroying of that person's life, of their family, and not only would it be an extraordinary act for a nonviolent drug offender, although we do it in other places in the country. In fact, we do it for profit in other places in the country. In Baltimore and in Maryland, we already have a fairly large selection of prison cells that we need for violent crime. So you're basically just putting them in spin. You're making sure that you ruin their life. You make them unemployable for the rest of their lives. You tar up their record with nonviolent drug arrests. But they go into spin. They go into probation before judgment. You lock them up again. There's no place to put them. But the police get paid for making the arrest, and the prosecutor gets paid, and the overtime gets paid, and the pretrial people get paid, and the company that puts the band on their ankle at $400 a week, they get money. Everybody gets rich. But the city is impaired. It doesn't get any safer. The guy goes back on the street, and he's not the guy pulling the trigger. Meanwhile, the guys pulling the trigger, the people who are genuinely violent, they stay on the street because everyone treats the Baltimore Police Department correctly, rationally, as if it were, the South African police in Soweto or the Israeli police in Gaza, or I should say the IDF in Gaza. You cannot emphasize what it feels like to be African American in Baltimore. You cannot overemphasize what it feels like to be African, and to know, as you're called into court as a juror, to sit in judgment of police testimony, how many times the police grabbed you on the street, locked you up for something called, let me think of one of the good charges. Loitering in a drug-free zone. The joke in Baltimore, by the way, is a drug-free zone is where drugs are free. That was the great street joke. But in reality, they made about 40% of the real estate of the inner city a drug-free zone. That is a zone, literally, where the Fourth Amendment of the United States Constitution has no meaning. I was sitting on my steps. It's a drug-free zone. You see the sign? You're going to jail. Now, these cases never went to court. They were dismissed when they got there, but you would spend a weekend, a night in jail. You'd be humiliated. You'd be strip-searched. You would be jacked up, walking back from a carryout with a sandwich. Your sandwich would be unrolled. The sandwich would be tossed in the street. Hey, there might have been cocaine in that sandwich. We don't know until we check for pills. The day-to-day, the quotidian humiliations of being black in Baltimore under the drug war. The drug war justified an increasing level of abuse and of bad policing. And it taught police how not to make an arrest. I know generations of police officers now in Baltimore who can't make a coherent arrest and write the report without perjuring themselves because they never had to learn probable cause. The drug war made probable cause irrelevant. I don't need to express probable cause to you. You're in a drug-free zone. Get up against I'm going into your pockets. That's my probable cause. It didn't matter that the cases couldn't have stood in a court of law. The law was passed, and we felt in our fear and in our worry about drugs that we were doing something meaningful. What we were really doing was teaching the communities of inner city Baltimore that the police lie, and they can always be relied to lie. And when you really need them to do police work, they're incapable. The detectives who I knew who could make a case in Baltimore, who I admired for their ability, and by the way, again, life is complicated. Some of these guys, some of the white detectives, the stuff that would come out of their mouth was so genuinely and grandiosely racist. And yet, I'm thinking of one guy in particular. I followed him for a year. I watched him make 12 cases, all of which involved African American victims, all of which involved him dealing with families, with suspects, with witnesses, all of whom were African American. I never saw him slip in his professional aspect, and I never saw him miss. He solved all 12 of them, to the point where I had to admit at the end of the year, if I was lying there dead in the 1200 block of Durham Street, I'd want this guy standing over me and to catch the case, and not some of the other guys who in their heads, had come out at some better place of humanity. Life is complicated, and cities are complicated. But that skill set that guy had 25 years ago is gone now. It isn't being trained to young detectives, and so they're not solving the murders. Well, what Jill Levy found in LA and what I found in Baltimore is you don't solve a murder that you should solve in the 1200 block of Durham Street, and you leave the guy on the corner, and a week later there's another murder. And a week later there's another murder. And then it's sort of a hot spot, and then there's 3 on one weekend. Because the thing that Levy found in South Central LA and the thing I found in Baltimore were the same, which is if the system fails, if the criminal justice system can't do the one most fundamental thing it's supposed to do, which is lock people up when they take human life, then we're all on our own. And it's not us who go back to our suburban houses, and it's the guy who lives in a row house in the middle of the block on Durham Street. He's on his own. His cousin was just killed. The people who killed his cousin, they think, oh, well, you got to come back on us. That's how it works. And since I figure you are coming back on us, whether you come back on us or not, I'm coming for you. And so the game is on. You either play or get played. And so you not only leave the guy on the street who's pulling the trigger to pull the trigger yet again, you create other trigger pullers because they can't rely on the state. The state is no longer has any aspect in their life when it comes to criminal justice. They're on their own in West Baltimore and East Baltimore and Pimlico. They're on their own. And so the murder rate climbs. It can be affected. You have to lock up the right people. The Boston Police Department in 1991 went around to every unit, and they actually asked, they said, give us the names of the 10 most violent repeat offenders you know from your files. Guys who we haven't caught, the guys who you hear their names over and over again. Just give us their names. And then they made a list of about 110 guys, and they focused on those guys. And the murder rate dropped by more than 100%. Cut it in half in 1 year. They focused on them. They ran warrant checks. They did weapons charges. They did caught them with drugs. But it was a targeted drug arrest, and when they got it, they made sure to do it with probable cause and to pull it through the system. They used anything they could to make sure that those 110 guys, or as many of them as they could, went away for a little while. And the murder rate disappeared in Boston. It was like an astonishing display of what targeted police work can do. The first thing you have to do, though, is you have to have people talking to you. And in Baltimore, the police department isn't trusted. Then you get to things like police shootings. Now, police shootings have to happen. Why? Because Americans as a nation have no self-control when it comes to firearms, because we are the most gun-saturated culture in the history of the globe. And we cannot pay people $48,000 a year to go out and police that environment and guess right every time. The thing that every police officer knows about a police shooting is that you could be the worst officer in the world, the most brutalizing, racist, indifferent son of a bitch, and you might make a good shooting. And you might never make a bad shooting in your career. And you might be the best, most earnest, most egalitarian police officer that has ever been trained to do the job, and you still might make a bad shooting. It's a second or two of deliberation under incredible adrenaline. There is no science to it. You can train and train and train, and when the moment happens, it can be a good shooting or a bad shooting, and it's over in a matter of seconds. And the lie that we tell ourselves as citizens is that, well, we train them to guess right. We train them. The average Baltimore police officer goes to the range twice a year, fires 40 bullets. It isn't John Wayne. You can't shoot the gun out of a guy's hand. You have to aim for center mass. You have to make the decision in a moment. And when I hear people describe sort of with outrage the bad shootings, and by bad I don't mean that the shooting was wrong when it happened. I mean we hit somebody has been hit by police gunfire who didn't need to be hurt or to die. The classic example, a gentleman in Cleveland will attest, is Tamir Rice in Cleveland. As a police reporter, Tamir Rice grieves me more than a lot of the victims because he's a kid. It's horrifying. It's unbelievably horrifying. In the construct of how he ended up shot, I'm less convinced that case wasn't properly adjudicated than others. In that, the officer who pulled up, it wasn't the best police work, but at a certain point, we cannot as a society say, if you make the wrong decision without malice, but with the limited reality of these seconds and whether or not you saw a weapon and whether or not you could discern whether the weapon was a toy or not, if we're going to make it on that basis, we can't indict you. And we're right to say that. That actually has to be the standard. It's heartbreaking, but the problem is not that it was a 15-year-old. The discerning factor is not that it was a 15-year-old child. The discerning factor is they were holding a replica gun, and we are a society where guns are the great equalizer. Guns are the great equalizer. Anybody can shoot you with a gun. The gun takes away all other factors. It's instantaneous death, and we allow it everywhere. And we coddle it everywhere. And we embrace it everywhere. It's a wonder that we're not killing each other at a faster rate. So I look at police shootings and I say, some of these things are horrifying. Some of them are awful police work, but not yet criminal. Some of them are genuinely criminal. Walter Scott, to me, in South Carolina, is genuinely criminal. It's a murder. Eric Garner is a manslaughter. But they're each individual cases. And they all come at this incredible stress point of we're asking them to basically police a prohibition that makes the entire community the enemy. When you lock everybody up, or you've locked everybody's brother or father or son up, and you're making, in a city of 600,000, which is the population of Baltimore, 620,000, you're making 100,000 arrests a year. You've lost your mind. And you're basically treating people as if you are an occupying army. And there's no discernment between a drug arrest of a nonviolent offender, and which you're making by the tens of thousands and getting paid for, and the arrest of somebody who's killed 3 people who you can't even find out their name. And that's the police department that we've inherited from the drug war. So the trick of the drug war is not merely that it's been brutalizing to people who have substance abuse problems or are poorest citizens or the people who are from this other America that wasn't incorporated into our post-industrial model. That's all true. But the other flip side of it is we can't even police our own cities anymore. It's ruined our deterrent. And it's made it so that the phone won't ring and that they don't look to the police department for help because they know no help is coming. And so they go out on the street themselves and they deal with it themselves. Or they turn the other cheek, which I'm sure that's the Chautauqua option, right? Turning the other cheek. In Baltimore, turning the other cheek gets hit. So, I'm from a different place. But ultimately, it's a rigged game for both sides. And the cost of this thing just keeps mounting. And there was a moment, I'll conclude with this just to show you how utterly distanced we are from actual empathy. I get asked to do like a lot of government stuff. Particularly the Obama administration. I'm sort of like a little bit of a ask him. He's on our side right now. So I got asked to do this panel. It was about the drug war and about taking a new look at mass incarceration and trying to reduce the prison population by 50% in America. Well, I'm all for that. But I said to the guy calling from the administration, I said, look, I don't want to, you with your panels, you'll study it, you'll talk, nothing will happen. No. This year, watch this year. They're going to give it to us because Obama's lame duck, and they want it too because it's costing too much money. It costs too damn much money to keep this many Americans in prison. So watch. The Koch people, the Koch brothers are behind it. The Republicans are behind it. The event we're asking you to do is co-sponsored, co-hosted by Newt Gingrich and Donna Brazile. This is the year we're going to get bipartisan support for criminal justice reform. All right, I'll do the panel. I'll go to Washington, get in the car, wear a tie. I'm nothing if not, I'm a giver. Anyway, I go to the panel. They sit me next to Newt Gingrich. I'm polite, which means I don't talk to him. You do what you can do, You do what you can do. I get up and I basically tell him I give him 10 minutes of what I just gave you. Everybody's polite, they clap. I get back to the table, Newt gets up, he smiles at me, he goes up, and he talks about how I make great television shows, but take a look at what New York did with mass arrest to make the city safer. Take a look at what Bratton did in New York. Take a look, there's a reason that Baltimore's Baltimore, and there's a reason New York is New York. And mass arrest and it all worked. It all worked. You have to have a firm hand. And he sits back down, and they've brought our dessert by this time. And I say to him, Congressman, I would agree with you, but then we'd both be wrong. And he laughs, because nothing actually matters, it's just all performance art. And I said, the difference between Baltimore and New York is New York had a 25, 30-year run-up on Wall Street, and they rebuilt the whole the only thing that can mug you in Manhattan now is a 2-star restaurant. And I'm serious. If you make North Avenue in Baltimore into Wall Street, and you make Wall Street into North Avenue, and you make Baltimore the financial capital of the world for over the last 30 years, we don't have any problems with crime either. New York has been transformed, it's been utterly rebuilt. I know, I'm trying to film 1970s New York in it now, and I can't find any of it. It's all CGI, believe me. So I said, this is, they were able to police the poor because the poor aren't there anymore. And ultimately, it wasn't because Giuliani locked everybody up, it was because the money came back to an American city. And there are certain cities that are immune from what I'm telling you now. And they are the west side of Los Angeles, the core of New York City, Washington, which of course has its own economy, and that's pretty much it. After that, we're all on our own. So I watched what happened, to end on a, because I cannot end on an optimistic note. I must bring you all down. To end on a note which was this: the bill. I'm watching the bill because like they took an hour of my life, that I can't get back, and a whole day if you count the drive to Washington. And I'm watching the bill go up through Congress, and the Koch people, and all of a sudden the Republicans all withdraw. Does everybody know the story? The Koch people inserted a line that basically said, okay, we'll reform the criminal justice system, we'll end mass incarceration, we'll scale back all those omnibus crime bills that were, bipartisan mistakes of the last 25 years. We'll start to rationalize the process for human beings, but can you please just put this little item in the bill that says, unless you really meant to defraud investors on Wall Street or in white-collar crime, unless you can be proven by your own statements or by written evidence that you had the intent to commit the white-collar crime we found you guilty of, you can't be convicted. They basically wanted to eviscerate all the white-collar prosecutions on Wall Street, and if you do that, we'll let all these black folk and brown folk out of prison. But until you do that, hey, there's nothing to talk about. And the bill died. So let it be a lesson to me. It's one thing to go talk to nice people at Chautauqua. It's another thing to rant and rave and make television shows and argue the point. Never go to a government panel. Never, ever believe when they say they're getting together and they're going to do the right thing. Just stand outside and yell into the window. So anyway, I think we'll go to questions, and now I will answer any question you want to know about television, right down to. But not seriously. Thank you.
So I would ask, for those of you who are leaving, please be respectful of those next to you, and with our guests, be as quiet as possible on your way out. Also, a reminder that we will be taking questions via Twitter using the hashtag #CHQ2016. David, you've, I think, talked pretty openly about your increased...
Should I go back?
Anywhere you'd like.
I thought we were going to talk like here. I didn't...
Well, no, because this is about questions from the audience here, so...
I thought you were going to be close to me and shield me from the questions from...
I'm pretty sure I don't need to shield David Simon, but you have talked with increased cynicism about the ability of journalism, particularly daily journalism, to affect, I think, any kind of meaningful change. I'm wondering if you can reflect on the role of journalism in addressing issues of race, policing, criminal justice, particularly in the past year since Ferguson.
I think, when I said that, I remember the quote where I sort of put that out there. And I think the second part of that quote is that journalism used to it seemed to have a better effect on astonishing and outraging people when it was done well. And you would get the right reaction from people. And I think the world itself is a little less inclined to outrage. And so even functional journalism now lands on its audience, and we go into the next thing. I think the world's almost moving too fast for outrage for the right kind of outrage to gather. And I was speaking to that. I admire nothing more than good journalism. I sort of thought I would be a journalist my whole life, and so I wasn't trying to denigrate the craft. I was more speaking to how it lands in this world. Listen, I think Donald Trump is the defining moment of it just doesn't matter how much is made apparent by the coverage. I think there also is, and certainly early on there was much more of it, there is this tendency on the part of journalism, on the one hand, on the other hand, we have to get both sides of, one of the things an editor told me halfway through my career that I never forgot, he said, sometimes there aren't two sides to a story. Sometimes one side is just a lie. And It was a very simple, but in journalism school, listen, you have to cover a beat for a long time, and you have to have information at your fingertips, and you have to know how to be able to make that judgment. In the beginning, when they make you a reporter, it's really a good tactic to go talk to everybody. It's essential. So I'm sort of speaking of, first there are rules, then you learn where the rules are no good. But it's got to be a process, and so I don't want to make journalism sound easier than it is, but it does seem like blow after blow after blow was landed on this fella, and he somehow cannot lose 35% of the American people. We're all astonished. I'm astonished that I think, are we in day 4 now of him going after the Khans, the Khan family? I mean, he can't give up a news cycle to it. He's unrelenting. He's going after these people now for day 4. But we saw this when he went after John McCain for being a POW, and that didn't finish him. I'm not going to stand here and say that this is going to hurt him. I don't know what hurts this guy. He's Father Coughlin. He's Huey Long. He's almost inanimate at this point.
This person writes as asking, as a former police commissioner, how would you train new policemen?
Well, first of all, I'd have to get them. Recruitment's down. And if you don't think that, by the way, I should visit one point that I failed to visit. The other mistake that we made in Baltimore was, okay, you have this moment where the guns are on the corner culture is dangerous, it does result in people being killed. One of the things that a police commissioner did recently, and by recently I mean maybe 5-6 years ago, and got the murder rate down in my city, was targeted guns, tried to make as many gun arrests as he could. It's not as effective as targeting shooters, but at least if you're getting the guns that are on the corner, if you're trying to change the corner culture. Anyway, they got the murders under 200 for the first time in a long while. It was good police work. It was not the same as locking people up. It doesn't have the same long-term effect, but he did kind of what Boston did. And when they charged the Freddie Gray case, which they overcharged because of the riot, sadly, there's a negligence case to be made in there somewhere, but the state's attorney didn't make it in Baltimore. They tried for second-degree murder, and they also tried for something. They tried to make a bunch of Fourth Amendment cases, meaning if you make an illegal arrest, we're going to charge you criminally. Not departmentally, but criminally. We're going to try to give you a criminal charge, maybe put you in jail because you made the wrong, you interpreted the Fourth Amendment wrong and probable cause when you made an arrest. I can't express to you how insane that is as public policy. Wait a second, I got a job for $48,000 a year, and if I make the wrong mistake, if I make a mistake on an arrest as to why I thought I could detain this guy or question him, I'm going to jail? I don't want the job. And he's right. He's right. Look, the Supreme Court has 3 different Fourth Amendment cases that change the law every session. They can't figure out the law in every possible circumstance. They keep making new law every year. You want some guy in Baltimore City to guess right every time, whenever he pulls somebody up on a corner, or he's going to jail? So recruitment's down. So to get back to the gentleman's question, first you got to convince them that this is a job that they would want. And I'm not sure at this point you can do that in this circumstance. But then, if you do get the right guy and he does want the job, I think you got to empower him to say, I need you to learn how to be a police officer. I need you to learn how to do police work. It's hard. Doing retroactive investigation is some of the hardest, most subtle stuff I've ever, the skill set, I admire it tremendously. And you got to have the people to train him. And when you find a guy like that, you got to exalt him within the police department. And you got to construct the reward system around that skill set. That the people who can lock up the right people, they get the overtime, they get the court pay, they get the promotion, they become the sergeants and lieutenants who train the next guy. And not have it be, you can make money on this job by playing the stat game in the drug war. You got to de-emphasize the stat. If I was the police commissioner, I would say, anybody who brings me a nonviolent drug arrest on the street, unless you explain to me how you're building something better, I'm not signing your overtime slip. I'm not signing your court pay. There's no reward for that. The police commissioner that does that, he starts to fix his police department.
How do you feel about the use of robotics and drones in policing?
That was weird, wasn't it, in Dallas? That was weird. I can't find, understanding sort of the legal principle of when you can take life as a police officer, I can't find anything in what Dallas did. You're all aware of what happened with Dallas with the use of the robot to kill the sniper who'd killed the police officers. Okay, well, the sniper had holed himself up. He wasn't surrendering. He had said he had a bomb. The police, they couldn't get him out. They couldn't extract him from where he was. He just killed a number and wounded a number of police officers. They sent in a robot, and the robot blew itself up and killed him. It's the first use, I think the seeming first use of a robot, of a drone, effectively, to kill a domestic suspect in a shooting. I can't find anything ethically wrong with it. I honestly can't. To ask the police officers, well, but it's creepy, don't clap. If you're not creeped out, I don't know what to do. There is something there that is, I've read Orwell. We're all worried about the same things down the road. But did I want to see the police officers rush that guy after having taken as many casualties as they already had? Did I want to see them try to even wrestle him to the ground, knowing he had claimed to have an explosive device? It seemed to me that the circumstance actually warranted the action. And yet there's a precedent there that I'm much more concerned about the Obama administration having used a drone to kill an American citizen overseas. And in fact, using drones in general to kill people overseas, but in particular, the legal ramifications of doing it overseas without trial and not in the heat of trying to deal with somebody who was actually shooting people, as in Dallas, was really unnerving to me. It was one place where I found myself in absolute agreement with Rand Paul, with the libertarians. I thought they raised the point. Credit where it is due. I'm not much on libertarianism, but Rand Paul was the only guy in the Senate to go, what did we just do? We just killed an American citizen with a drone overseas? No trial? Okay, think on that. That one scared me more than Dallas. So.
Are the policing problems in the city replicated in the drug problems in the suburbs and small towns in relation with heroin and meth?
I think the meth epidemic in the West and in smaller places is, as a health dynamic, is entirely analogous to heroin and cocaine. I am certainly not pro-drugs. So I regard this all as grist for an incredibly aggressive public health and social work intervention. And by the way, we're finding out just how entrenched opiates are in the white community, just from the level of addiction and overdose that we're now seeing from prescription opiates. So it's not even a pharmacological divide with methamphetamine. But what you don't see as much in rural America is the violence. And that's because basically you see a little of it, but it's not the same rates of violent death because I believe the efforts made to interject in the urban drug trade have an element of social control and racial control that have led to a dynamic that's it's when you declare a war and you act as if it's a war and you militarize your police department and you have levels of incarceration that are like wartime levels. By the way, no other country on the face of the earth has as many people in prison as the United States of America, and I'm not talking per capita, I'm talking raw numbers. Think about that. China doesn't have as many people in prison as we do, and they're working on a few billion. So, we've reached a level where we're trying to use the drug war and the manifestations of this level of policing as social control. This is what we're doing with our poor. This is getting rid of the poor. If we said kill the poor, we'd be a little more honest. We'd be more brutal, but we'd be a little more honest. And so I look at that and I think, it's not happening where it's not happening because we're not at the pressure point of society. It's not where the poor are rubbing up against affluence in the same way. We could buy into a Giuliani or a Bratton saying, we got to lock them up when they first start squeegeeing your windshield when you come through the Midtown Tunnel. Because if we don't, society itself, civilization could fall. So they're all going to Rikers. We could buy that in a town where the affluence was rubbing up against the poverty as it was. And that can sell there in a way that I don't think it needs to sell elsewhere.
We have several questions regarding Freddie Gray. And this person writes, the biggest police case is in your town. What about Freddie Gray? What happened? Questions about the medical examiner, questions about decisions of the police officers.
Sure. Okay, again, I don't satisfy anyone on this because I actually covered this stuff, so I end up where the case goes. I think to work backwards, Freddie Gray is a negligent death, and somebody needs to address the fact that he was a negligent death. He was injured in the back of that van. They rode him around for 45 minutes. They didn't check on him properly. They didn't secure him properly. That needs to be accounted for. Whether it's a criminal case or whether it's an administrative investigation that results in sanctions against the responsible officers, that's a question I'm not quite sure. There was a possibility, and maybe even a good possibility, they could have made that case of negligent death, or the case of criminal negligence, I should say, against the officers. Instead, in the wake of those riots and in the fear that the next weekend was going to lead to more rioting, they charged second-degree murder and manslaughter. And there was no evidence that it was sustainable, that anything like that happened. The medical examiner places the actual injury that causes Freddie Gray's death it's from him hitting the bulkhead at some point with his head inside where he, the police officer, he was not fatally injured when he went in, he was fatally injured when they found him inside, and it's consistent with him hitting the bulkhead. Now, there's one circumstance in which you could argue that it's manslaughter or murder, and that's as if they drove him around trying to give him what used to be known in Baltimore as a rough ride, meaning it was usually reserved for guys who fought the police. You fought the police on the street, you punched police on the street, drew a weapon on the street, whatever you did on the street, sometimes the rough ride came after. But they actually have footage of that van going around the corners, and it's not doing the stuff that a rough ride would do. Big, wide turns, driving 30, 35 miles an hour, not driving. It's not the rough ride, or at least we don't have that footage. Now, was that culled by the police department? Did it disappear? I don't know. Do I trust the police department to present? No, and clearly the state's attorney didn't trust the police department either. They tried to investigate it using their own resources otherwise. But what came into court, you can't convict on. Certainly not and I spoke earlier about the Fourth Amendment stuff. Those charges were crazy. So you're left with this situation where a young man has died. The police are responsible. He was in police custody. We have a right to expect that when he's put in the back of a police wagon, he's either going to get to the central lockup safely, or he's going to get to a hospital if he's hurt, and not be driven around for 45 minutes. So I understand the fury of, I sort of get both sides. I understand the fury of people who are saying, you didn't do anything. There was no response to this. How could this, I understand that. I think the case was poorly made. I think it was overcharged. And it was and once, of course, even though they had the lesser charges, once you give the jury or a judge, even a judge, a narrative that says, this is our theory of the case, we think they gave him a rough ride, and then you show him footage, and the judge is going, I got nothing here on which to rule. The judge, Judge Williams, I think did an honorable, he took an honorable pass at the evidence, and it led him where he led him. But does Freddie Gray's death still need to be addressed? It does. And I guess the last best hope for that is the administrative process within the police department. And I sure wish there was civilian review on that, of that process. That's a whole nother issue. And there's not. So that's where Freddie Gray is.
Question from Twitter, what about the militarization of police? Is this as risky as what the drug war has done to police effectiveness?
Yeah, you know, what could be, actually, I was glad for just how militarized the police response sometimes is, because I think it's one of the most effective weapons for Black Lives Matter. The imagery from Ferguson of armored personnel carriers and guys in riot gear and carrying M16s and hands up, I thought it advanced the cause of people reflecting on where we've gone with our policing and our law enforcement ethos more than almost anything you could write about it. If you saw some of the coverage out of Baton Rouge, which is one of the most, Louisiana is the most incarcerative state in our country, and therefore the most incarcerative jurisdiction on the planet. And Baton Rouge is not New Orleans. It's not my beloved New Orleans. It's its own place, and it has little regard for African American communities within it. And I thought those images were very powerful. If you're not policing a community that you've turned against you, you don't need all that gear. And you're not going to get them to pick up the phone and call you if that's the face that you present to those communities. There's a reason the phone doesn't ring anymore in American police departments. There's a reason that they can't get anybody to trust them. And no one, I wouldn't trust them. I mean, that's just, the best detectives I knew, when it came time to arrest a murder suspect, they'd go up on the porch, one of the guys would take a gun out, put it behind his back so he had it present, but not knock on the door, wait for somebody to come to the door, stand to the side, say, is Tommy there? Is Tony there? Yeah, Tony, it's city homicide. You want to come with us? I saw 150 arrests done that way without incident. I didn't ever see them need the SWAT team. Now, I don't think they arrest a murder suspect without kicking in the door, without guys in full body armor. It's crazy. It's crazy. We've reached this point of just absolute distrust, and I think fundamentally, since more police officers aren't dying in the line of duty than in the past, I think the blame has to go to law enforcement.
Why haven't police organizations nationwide banded together to encourage legislation to ban assault weapons and large magazines?
They have. All of the police lobbying organizations, all of the International Association of Police Chiefs, they've been against this stuff, as well as cop killing bullets. They've been against it as a matter of routine. Their opinions, they are held up as paragons by politicians when somebody wants to make a law and order appeal, but at the exact moment where they say anything against our great American Moloch, our love of the gun, at the moment that they interpose there, suddenly nobody can hear or regard our police officers. They don't have a thing to say that anybody wants to hear in Congress. But they absolutely have taken a position against assault weapons, against certain types of ammunition, against high caliber. Believe me, they would love to see elements of gun control introduced to make their jobs easier, but that goes up against a much more powerful lobbying culture.
To what degree does poor attention or a lack of attention to mental health intersect with the high numbers of incarcerations in this country?
I don't know. Sometimes my mother taught me to say I don't know when I haven't done it, when I don't have any data at my finger. Speculatively, I'd say, given the fact that we don't have a lot of institutional interposition with people who need mental health care, and that there are probably people slipping through the cracks and washing up in courtrooms, I'd say that's probably compounding problems, but I don't have any data. It's not been something that I actually looked into.
This person asks, do you think that your television shows have been able to affect social change with regard to the criminal justice system?
Clearly not. It got me invited to the White House, So I'm doing all right. No, I mean, I don't know what to say. I think the best I could say for The Wire, I guess, is that there's now a discussion ongoing. I think there are more people who are down on the drug war than when we started. I think we've managed to get an argument going. And I think certain states have, here's a good, you know what, I'll take credit, not for The Wire, but let me give no credit to The Wire or myself, but just the level of the argument has reached the point where, anybody know what Nathan Deal's doing in Georgia? Nathan Deal is the governor of Georgia. It's a red state. He's a red state governor. He's a Republican governor. He's closing prisons. He looked at it first as a financial burden on his state to have this many people locked up. He said it's crazy. And then he started going to the prisons and meeting the people he was going to let out. And then he fell in love with the idea because of course he met human beings. And good old red state Georgia is leading the way in the country in terms of getting rid of mass incarceration. If I see him stand next to Donald Trump, I'll take everything back. But Nathan Deal right now is an honest-to-God hero.
This person asks, what is going right in America? And I should add, there's a little smiley face there.
Well, for one thing, the Baltimore Orioles are near the top in the AL East. So how bad could it be? I think the conversations we're now having about race, as fraught as they are, as angry as they are, the demands for reconsideration of the dynamic by which communities of color are policed, I think this is necessary and healthy. I think it was on hold for a while. I think it was masked by our fears of crime that were disproportionate to the actual threat, and by our fears of drugs that were disproportionate to the actual threat. And I think in some ways, what's happening now is necessary, and we're going to end in a better place. The other thing that I happen to know from my own city is I live in a majority black city, is that we spend an awful lot of time, and I spend a lot of time, because this is where the fault lines of society are, with people who are poor and people who are struggling. Nobody ever wrote a great drama series about people on the end of a cul-de-sac in Woodlawn. And nobody ever will, so don't be waiting on it. But the truth is, in my lifetime, look, God willing, I'm going to see the first, not only the first African American president, but the first female president. I knew in my head, in fact, the first female president was way overdue based on demographics. But you couldn't have told me 8 years ago that I was going to live long enough to see an African American be my president. That's a country that's growing up some. Now, is there an incredibly vicious, he's not an American, he's a Muslim? Yeah, of course there's a reaction. But a lot of the anger that we're witnessing in this election cycle, I'm convinced, is the rearguard action of an America that's dying away, and is angry. It's angry that it's dying away. By the way, there's nothing wrong with being white or male, but nothing that can't be overcome. But or so my wife tells me. But that's the point, is that what you're basically going to be entitled to from now going forward, and we learned this in 2008, and we learned it in 2012, we're going to learn it again this year, is what you're entitled to is being part of a plurality, is being part of walking into the room and arguing your points and being heard among other people who are also arguing their points and being heard. The days of the majority logic prevailing are dying. And they're not, the people who are fighting against this, they sense that. This is the wisdom, and it was wisdom, of Pat Buchanan 20 years ago. He saw it ending. And he said bluntly, and with all the racist vigor that he could, we're losing this. My God, we're losing this. I mean, go back and read his presidential run. It's magnificent in its prescience of Donald Trump. He said, we're losing, if we don't solve this immigration thing, if we don't fix the white birth rate, if we don't, America will not be my America. Yeah. So that doesn't mean it's inhospitable to anybody. It doesn't have to mean anything like that. But what it means is we're all going to have to contemplate what it means to be an American in a completely different way. That to me is exhilarating. That solves, once enough people get that, we solve a lot of problems that we've now made for ourselves. So, how's that for optimism?
I want to go to our final question here. And first I'd ask, could I have everyone who's a resident of a city in the United States raise their hands? So my question, David, to you to wrap this up. What responsibility do we as citizens of American cities have in terms of addressing these issues, and what should we walk away with from this morning and being charged with helping those cities move forward?
Well, if you're living in a city, God bless you, don't move. Don't move to the suburbs. Don't create more infrastructure. Embrace the idea that you're going to grow old and finish out. It used to kill me. I live in South Baltimore. It used to kill me when their kids would get to be school age, and they would move out to the suburbs from my block. I didn't have any kids living in my neighborhood. It's a racially mixed neighborhood, but mostly white. It's 4 blocks away from a public housing project, so the elementary schools were racially mixed. And if you've read Andrew Hacker's the little thin book that basically was so honest about race, Two Nations. Even good people who I'm a good liberal, but man, that moment where it goes from 12% minority to 15% minority in my elementary school, that's when I start thinking about private school or the county. Those percentages are now changing, and they did change in my neighborhood. And now all the kids, all the people stay in their row houses, past when the kids are out of Montessori, and they're all going to Thomas Johnson and Federal Hill Elementary, and the schools are now racially mixed. It's like there came this weighted moment where people just committed to my little part of Baltimore. It was exhilarating to see families staying. So listen, if you vote with your lives and your taxes and your children, and you stay in America's cities, you're part of the army, and that's a big deal. And then the other thing is, I would say, just really enjoy the fact that you can get things in cities that are only there because of the grand and improbable differences of all of us. The thing I love most about America, the thing that makes me patriotic more than anything, is our music. I'm a music nut, and I love American roots music. And you can't love American roots music without knowing that African American music is the most unlikely. Let me understand this. We're going to take these people, make them slaves, take them in through New Orleans. They're going to come from West Africa, where they have these rhythms, where they flat the 3rd notes, flat the 7th notes. We're going to give them, the boats are going to come off from the Spanish-American War. The army bands, they're all going to want to get laid because they're coming back from Cuba. This is all true, by the way. William Randolph Hearst gave America jazz. Absolutely. You think I'm kidding? It's the absolute history. The boats came in, the army bands, after the Spanish-American War, 1898, they all sold off their instruments so they could all go to Storyville and get laid. The instruments ended up in all the pawn shops and all the windows of the French Quarter. African Americans bought them. African Americans had been allowed since the time of the French planters to play music, mostly drum circles, in Congo Square, just on the other side of Rampart Street. That had been going on for a century. Now suddenly they had brass instruments and drums. And they figured out a little something called American music. And it happened in about 8 square blocks of an American city where different people were obliged to live next to each other and rub up against each other. That's the genius of the American race, is the acquisition and cross-cultural pollination that makes us great. And there's only going to be more of it. And what's happening in New Orleans now is even more charming, is all of the Mexican and Central American workers who came in to help clear away and rebuild after Katrina. They've brought their music. And now there's this incredible Latin tinge starting up with the brass bands. There's we're watching the beginning of another wave of American music because New Orleans suddenly has a fresh wave of influence. It's really, the other day I saw a second line, I saw some form of mariachi funk coming down the street at me. And it was great. It was great. So,
ladies and gentlemen, David Simon.
Thank you. Thank you so much.